Welcome to the Around the Table podcast, where we believe that there's room for everyone at the table. Great conversation, fellowship, growth, and healing can all happen around the table. So pull up a chair and let's jump into today's discussion.
Hey everybody, you're listening to the Around the Table podcast, and I have a special guest today, Jonathan Stockstill from Bethany Church. And Jonathan, I just want to say thank you so much for being with us today and coming to the great city of Longview, Texas, from Baton Rouge.
The booming metropolis.
The booming metropolis, yeah. I had Jelani Lewis from Dallas on recently, and I said, it's been hard to find your way around Longview after living in Dallas, such a small town like Dallas, but we love Longview.
Man, I love being here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're super honored to have you here. Jonathan comes from a family of incredible ministry leaders, and he himself is an incredible ministry leader. And just honored to have you here today. I want to start off by talking just about our history, about how we met, because I got to meet you at a time that was really pivotal for me. In 2019, I had just taken over the church from my dad and ran into your brother Joel at Gateway Church. And it was crazy because I was probably 2 months in to leading the church. And all of a sudden, Bethany, church stuff starts showing up at my door, both here at the church and at my house, which I'm like, how did they even get my information? But because I'd never got anything from Bethany before. It's
like Amazon. It's like Alexa, bro. We heard your conversation. We're like, target that guy.
That I really thought something like that must have happened, like a Google search of any transitions happened recently, because the conference was for fathers and sons that transitioned, right? 2019, right. Bethany conference. The first thing I got, I was like, that's fascinating. I should probably look into it. And then a week later, I got something else. And I was like, all right, this is getting serious.
We sensed it.
So I ran into...
You doubled down.
Yeah, you doubled down. You're like, we got to get this guy because it's really fresh. Ran into your brother, and he was like, man, you need to go to this, and I will meet you there. He was so kind. And Tandra and I drove to Baton Rouge, not knowing anybody except for possibly Joel, barely. And he met us there and was so kind to take us to lunch. And then we're standing in line to get in, and somebody randomly shows up, says, hey, would you like to come to the back and meet Pastor Jonathan? We were like, yeah, okay. So we go to the back and we get to meet you, and it was like just, man, I really needed to have these conversations with you. So thank you and your team for that. But that started kind of our introduction to Bethany All Access, which, if you guys don't know, Pastor Jonathan pastors Bethany Church. How many years has Bethany been around?
Next year, 60.
60 years.
So we're doing a big shebang, 60 years.
Man, that's incredible. And he had taken over for his dad. And so really I wanted you just to take a minute and talk about the history of Bethany Church and how many campuses you guys have now and how many campuses you had when you took over.
Yeah. All right. So which one you want first? I'll talk about the campuses and then we'll talk about Bethany. So we have 5 geographical campuses in Baton Rouge, what we call Livingston, the city of Livingston, Baker, Louisiana, which was the OG, the original. In New Orleans and in Houma. Yeah. So it's all in that southern Louisiana zone. And then when I took the church, we had 2 campuses. We had what we called a north and a south campus. Now we call it Baker and Baton Rouge because
sounds real familiar.
Because we're in other places. Yeah. So yeah. But Bethany started in 1963. My grandfather started the church, and he was a Southern Baptist pastor, and he had an experience with God that really changed his life, and he had a hard time in that circle expressing that perspective, which was just the baptism of the Holy Spirit. Yeah. He got engaged with, at the time, his name was Kenneth Hagin, and he was building churches. My grandfather started building churches, was a contractor, and he went to a Kenneth Hagin meeting, and Kenneth Hagin called him from the back and said, sir, I don't know you, but the Lord just tells me you're going to start a church and it's going to impact the world.
Wow.
So he was like, he was building churches, and he was like, okay. And he was dressed like a construction worker.
Wow.
So he goes home and decided to start Bethany. And so in 1963, he started the church. God intertwined him with some great men of God that he did ministry with for a long time. Guys like John Osteen, who started Lakewood, he and my grandfather were best friends. They did missions work all over the world together. And so he pastored it for 20 years. And then in 1983, my dad came off the mission field. He was a missionary to Africa and Ghana and Nigeria. So my dad comes off the mission field, and he was an associate pastor there for a few months. And then there was a transition. And I guess we want to talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that in a minute, but keep going. We'll come back to that.
So in 1983, my dad became the pastor and pastored for 28 years. Wow. And then in 2011, my dad went back into full-time missions work, and my wife and I stepped in and started to help lead the church at that point in 2011. So at the time of this podcast, it's been 10 and a half, almost 11 years that we've been pastoring the church.
That's awesome. Yeah, that is a legacy right there. And the way that, I always love to hear this story, the way that your dad got handed the church, essentially. Tell us that story.
So he, fresh off of the mission field, comes in from Ghana. He started doing some, before the sermon, he would do a sermonette. So he'd get a little word prepared, and he's 29 at the time, 29 years old. He would get a little sermon prepared, and he would do the teaching, and people loved that moment. And so my grandfather was 63 at the time, and he could just tell that he was getting near that retirement age. And there was a service one night, a missionary from Mexico, his name was Danny Ost, was there. And Danny Ost was kind of considered one of the overseers of the ministry, was just spiritual leadership. And so my grandfather and Danny Ost were standing next to each other, and they were all worshiping. Danny Ost leans over to my grandfather, and he says, I think the Holy Spirit wants to let Larry lead the church. So my grandfather said, I agree with that. And he walked back, and my dad was on a row behind him, and he said, hey, we feel like the Holy Spirit is speaking that you're going to lead the church. And my dad said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. And kept worshiping, and the Lord just dealt with him and said, no, this is me, and you're to do it. So before the song service was even over, they had agreed to this transition. And the church at the time was probably around 1,500 people.
Wow. So
for that time in 1980, it was a significant church, large church, impactful church, strong emphasis in missions. But so he got up to the pulpit and he said, hey, tonight we're going to do a transition, and we're going to tonight we're going to pray over Larry and Melanie as they take over the church. My dad and mom went forward. Gosh. They prayed for them. The next day, my grandfather left to New Mexico to go visit
it was like
my dad's sister, and just
fast?
was gone for several months. And so my dad was just like off to the races.
I mean, that is shocking how that happened. I mean, it's biblical, but it was like so fast.
I know. Well, I mean, today's world, we think so differently with it. It's like, no, but in that time, it wasn't.
Like, I need time to process. I mean, I know that when I think I heard that story at the conference, and when my dad had approached me, really the elders approached me and said, hey, we feel like you're supposed to take the church. And I had not said anything to anybody that the Lord had dealt with me on that, because I really was like, it's going to need to be supernatural. And I thought maybe a 5-year type transition, and it ended up being 1. I can't imagine the same night, the same day, just being like, all right, this is what's supposed to happen, and then him piecing out for months at a time. How did it happen with you?
So it was a bit longer of a process. It was a similar scenario where Bethany is set up, the government of the church is set up to where we have a presbytery, an overseeing presbytery, which we would just call apostolic elders that oversee the church. And one of them had talked to the others, but they felt like it was time for my dad to go back into full-time missions. He had expressed that. And so they went to several people that were being considered as candidates. I was one of them. So they came to me and said, we're praying about the next season for the church, and you're being talked about as a successor. And my answer was just like, I don't feel like that's for me.
Yeah.
I felt like I would be doing worship music for a lot longer, and my wife and I had dreams of what we would do in 10 years, and it wasn't that. So that was the case for a couple months, and nothing moved. It just was like, just at a dead standstill. The subject kind of dropped, and I had an experience with the Lord. I could bring you to the exact spot. I was in my truck, and it was just a visitation. The Lord said, I want you to pastor the church. And it was a strong conviction.
Yeah.
And so I pulled over on the side of the road and had an emotional moment, just like I felt God's presence so strong and like a total heart change. And so I called the elders together and I said, hey, this is what happened. And, just wanted to tell y'all. And they said, well, this is the Lord. And so my dad and I actually prayed and fasted for 21 days together before we announced it to the church, because we both wanted to make sure we weren't just thinking crazy. And we both felt really good about it. So we announced it to the church in April of 2011. And then in October, we did a transition service. So the whole process was about a year.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's a similar story to mine, except for I'd felt before they told me. But what a legacy to stay in the family for 60 years. Did you want to be a pastor ever growing up?
I thought I wanted to be an evangelist. I imagined that I would do crusades.
I can still see that in you.
And hey, maybe, I don't know.
I mean, the evangelist heart is still in you for sure.
So, but that's what I thought that I would do is evangelism. And then I think in my upper 20s, I thought that I possibly would pastor a church, but I thought I would start it in a different state.
Yeah, wouldn't be a part of Bethany.
Yeah.
I never wanted to be. The Lord did a work on my heart. And when your dad took over, was it already called Bethany World Outreach Center?
So it was called Bethany Baptist Church.
Okay.
And it wasn't a Baptist church.
Right. It was just always the funny
But what
story.
it was is, in that time, non-denominational churches weren't really a thing. They were starting to happen. And all of my grandfather's best friends were Southern Baptist pastors. So he's still related to the Baptist denomination, still went to all the assemblies and was great friends with all those guys. So he just called it Bethany Baptist Church.
Yeah.
And then I think in the 70s, in the late 70s, that Baptist name fell off. When my dad became the pastor, because he was such a mission-minded person and because he was such a prayer-minded person, he called the church Bethany World Prayer Center.
Okay.
So it was like all about the world's all about prayer, and this is a place where we're going to do it. So people mess up that name all the time. They're like Bethany World Outreach
That's
Harvest
what I thought
Center.
it was. So it's Bethany World Prayer Center.
It was.
Yeah.
I changed it back to Bethany Church because there's no way people could get it right. So it's just Bethany Church.
It's really just Bethany now.
Yeah, it's just Bethany.
Like people know it as Bethany.
Bethany.com.
Which I love. I mean, first of all, that's a URL that I can't believe you have, which is amazing.
We started early. We got it right when it came out.
That's a good deal right there. One of the things that I've so admired just about you and about Bethany, and I really think is a part of Bethany's legacy, is just a model of generational ministry. And what does that look like, first of all, within a family? And maybe we could even touch on how does that look like what could that look like for people who are not in vocational ministry? Because we're all called to ministry.
Yeah.
Some people are in vocational ministry, but how can a family have generational ministry if they're not in vocational ministry?
Obviously, man, the biggest critique in any type of family ministry is nepotism. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you would favor a blood son or a relative over a viable candidate.
Right.
And that is a very legitimate critique of family ministry. Yet the combative thought to that and the balance to that critique is God uses families.
Right.
And this is throughout the Old Testament. It was Abraham. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Why did God go generations down there? Why did God choose Aaron and his brother Moses and Miriam and use them in leadership? Why did God choose Jesus and then his first cousin was his forerunner? And it's very scriptural that God uses families. A lot of times because there's similar values. And I also believe that God falls in love with a person. And like Phinehas in the book of Numbers, he said, because of this act of zeal, there's always going to be one of your descendants in the priestly line. God visits his kindness upon generation and generation. Right. So without question, God is a generational God. Now, I think the validity of the critique that, man, if somebody is not called to do ministry, you can't right. force God's hand in that. But like in our case at Bethany, I had been in the ministry there for 15 years as a worship pastor, youth leader, college director, you name it, I did it, from janitor to maintenance. There was nobody around that had served in that house like I had, and had the leadership with the people that I had. And so it would have been crazy to not consider me just from a common sense standpoint. Right. But I feel like God's presence has to be obvious and made known, and it has to be confirmed by an eldership, a board, to where it's not just a person, one person deciding this whole thing.
Right.
But the fruit will always be seen. If the person is not supposed to lead, the whole work's going to crumble.
Yeah. Because
it wasn't supposed to be that way. But if God's grace is on them, it'll flourish. So I said a lot there. But,
no, I mean it.
But there's a true balance there of, man, you can't move outside of God's grace. If God hasn't graced someone to do something, it's a horrible thing to try to put that weight on them. But it's also horrible to not consider God as a generational God, and that he can bless generations and use generations, when throughout scriptures, that's what he does.
Yeah.
So I think you have to live in that tension.
For sure. And that was really part of the hesitancy, I know, early on, at least in me, was like I didn't feel initially called to it. I always thought I was going to do something else. I actually went to school for multimedia production and marketing and things like that, which still served me well to this day in a number of areas. But we were very aware of the potential of people thinking, okay, well, this is nepotism or something like that. So that's why my dad really never even suggested or considered me, because he didn't want that to be the case. And never growing up did he ever say, hey, you need to be a pastor, or you need to be, he was just like, whatever God tells you to do is what you need to do. And so I never felt the push in any direction other than to listen to the voice of God and whatever he tells me to do. And I feel like that was probably very similar with you guys. But so,
and I'll say this, there's like in a church, there's a certain DNA in a house, and it comes from the values, it comes from the teaching of the house, it comes from the anointing that God has placed on the leadership. And oftentimes a blood son carries those values intrinsically so deeply because it comes so close. And I know in my case, it was the values of Bethany, which would be prayer, missions, small groups, integrity, worship, student ministry, all those things I carried so deep in my heart. And that's often the case with a family person, as they have that. Not that is the license to do it, but it is something that they carry.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And that was really, I feel like, the case with me as well. I ended up getting hired on here for media, and was in the media department doing graphics and web design and video for many, many years before the elders approached me again and were like, hey, our executive pastor is going back into the marketplace, and you're already doing a lot of the things that he does just because you have a heart for the church. Is this something you would consider? And that scared me, but felt peace instantly. But it was like you said, you grow up in the house, you carry a heart for the house, the vision, the values, all of those things, and you've given your life to it, so it's very easy to continue to give your life to it if God has called you to do it. And I think that's the big one, because you have seen, and we all have seen, cases where there has been a handoff of something to a family member that the grace was not there for it. It was a case of nepotism, but you don't find that out till later when it's not working, and that's a sad thing as well. But like you said, I think you said it very well. Like, you don't want to put that weight. It's not fair to put that weight on someone.
It's not fair to put that weight.
So what does that look like, or is it possible? I mean, how would you say it's possible for a family who's not in vocational ministry to have what a generational style of ministry in their family, like you see in the Bible?
Well, you see it in business all the time.
That's true.
Like business, it's very clear, family-run businesses that stay in the family, and I think that's a clear indication of it working in other places. But this separation of clergy and laity is not a scriptural concept. It's us applying Old Testament principles to New Covenant realities, and it's not supposed to be that separation. I think every family can have a legacy of ministry.
Yes.
I'll give you some examples. I think that there are graces and giftings on certain families that stay for generations.
Yeah.
For instance, some people have a gift of generosity. They make millions of dollars and give millions of dollars into the kingdom of God. Take the Green family and Hobby Lobby.
Mark.
So you got Mark Green, and Mark doesn't make decisions by himself. He brings those family together. They sit around once a month, and they all bring potential investments, kingdom investments, to the table, and they'll decide on those investments together. And his kids and his grandkids all carry this legacy of generosity. And this is not just Mark Green's gift of generosity. This goes throughout the whole family.
Yeah.
You see that in the same. I know families that do incredible at hosting, and the grandma cooks and she has people over and blesses them, but the daughter cooks, and there's this family grace of generosity. It's said of Philip that he had daughters that prophesied, and that anointing flowed in his family. So I believe that God will visit even anointings on generations. So that might be some of the answer to what you're saying is just ask the Lord, what is the gift that he's placed on your life? And it might be a legacy gift. It might be something that your family's going to do together and that you're going to have for generations.
No, I love that. And that's really why I asked that question, because I agree with you that so many people separate and they think, the only way that there's generational ministry is if it is vocational, because they can see it more visibly. But yet I agree with you 100% that we're all called to ministry, and there are things, just like, I talked about this recently, but there can be generational things passed down that are negative, sin patterns, proclivities, things like that. But then also righteousness can be passed down generationally. The giftings can be passed down generationally. And I would love to see more families create family missions for their family to say, this is what our family is about, because this is how God has gifted and graced us. And
healthy families do that.
That's exactly right.
Healthy families take the time to discover their values, to proclaim their mission. And, I love to see families that take the time to recognize what God's doing in their life and articulate it.
Yes.
Write it down, and it become a banner of, hey, this is who we are.
Yeah, because that speaks to the identity for generations. Because you just continue, this is what we do. And I love that. So let's go back to Bethany Church for a minute, because I consider Bethany to be a very healthy church. And I was telling you this just on the way here. Like, every time I've been to Bethany, I just feel the presence of God. It feels like home. I love being in a service at Bethany. So since it's a 60-year-old church, like what would you say is, and I know you're not going to like this phrase maybe, but what's the secret sauce of Bethany, or how do you keep, something for 60 plus years having fresh life and continuing to just continue to see God's hand on Bethany?
Okay. A lot of these comments are off the cuff, but let me give you one word that I feel like is super important, and it's the word authenticity. And I think a synonym would be sincerity, which is, we're not going to fake like we love God and have this form of church, but it's just this business. And it's just like, from the top down, we have to remain authentic in our love for the Lord. And that's seen in our private devotion, seen in our prayer life, the time we spend in the Word. And men, nobody is without fault, but a leadership of a church, and that's the entire leadership, pastoral teams, small group leaders, have to maintain a spiritual fervor that's authentic and sincere. Yeah. And the church has to flow from that place of sincerity. I do think there are several pillars that create an environment of health. One is sound teaching, which means we're not trying to make the word say anything that it's not saying. We do teach line upon line. We believe the full counsel of God and teach it. I think that creates healthy church. I think active prayer ministry in church, which means we don't just have a prayer ministry that prays in a closet, like the whole church prays. We have active prayer lives. I think that's a big contributor to that overall sense of health.
Yeah.
That environment of also a continual passion for the lost and for the world, where the global kingdom and that mindset of we're going to continue to keep our focus on the whole world and locally. Outreach, strong sense of outreach, not an internal obsession, but it's constantly focused out. I also think focusing on the next generation is a vibrant source of health, that whenever a church stops focusing on students and young people, can start to shrivel up. And so you have all these things that I think create pillars of stability and health in a local church. And so I've named some of them that are important for us.
Yeah, and you can see that. It's very clear. It's not like you have to go searching for those things when you're at or around Bethany. So, and I, knowing you personally, I've seen that lived out in your life. And I don't know you super well, but what I've seen is just the authenticity and the heart for God. And I've always told people, man, that's what has attracted me to you and to Bethany, is you're not trying to be anybody but a follower of Jesus. It's just your heart is so pure before Him. And so, man, I'm just want to honor you in that and say thank you for being an authentic leader who just loves Jesus. It bleeds out to all of your team. So I'm grateful for that. Let me ask you another one here. What do you see as the biggest challenge for the capital C church in today's culture?
Well, that's a tough question, because I would answer the Western church different than I think the Eastern church. Well,
let's speak to the Western church.
Western church is, I think, a lot of this idea, which is healthy, is that, man, we got to win the world. And so to do that, we've got to love everybody, and they've got to sense from us this deep, deep love. And it's caused us to not have any convictions and any boundaries. And so we're so bland, we don't stand out, and our convictions are too so loose.
Yeah.
I also think a weakness for the Western church is, and it sounds so horrible to nitpick and say what's wrong with, but you worded it, challenges. I think our lack of focus on the globe, our desire to grow bigger churches, our desire to build the church that we're building versus build the kingdom. I think it's a toxic thought, and the more the church can think global kingdom, the healthier it is. I think if I were to say another one, I would say a lack of spirituality, which church has become a philosophical and social expression, and we've missed a lot of the spiritual importance of things like prayer, fasting, devotion, and so if I were to summarize those three, I would say the church is very worldly, the church is very self-focused, and the church is unspiritual.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of those, especially the first one you said, and I think they probably bleed into each other, because the more self-focused you become, the more fleshly you become. And you said the church is very worldly, or challenges it could be. A lot of times, you see that people in the church, look, we all deal with stuff, but when your values become the same as the world's values, when your standards become the same as the world's standards, then there's nothing to separate you. You just, like you said, bland. They become very bland or blended in. And that, I feel like, is just one of the biggest challenges that I've personally seen, is that people are afraid to be different. In the Bible, it calls us to a completely different life. I mean, holy, set apart. We're not supposed to look like or act like or have the same focuses in our life as the world. And some of that has bled into the church, like you mentioned, even when we become so self-focused that we forget globally we're a part of a kingdom, a much bigger kingdom. we're an outpost of a kingdom here, but we're a part of a much bigger kingdom. And I know even something that I've been talking even to you and some of our team about, just like personally within our church, that's something I want to keep expanding and growing our view of the global church, and how are we a part of helping advance the kingdom all over.
I think every church at a minimal needs to have a foreign relationship that's meaningful, that turns their attention to the globe, and at least one.
Yeah.
And up to 10, 20, I'm not talking about friends relationships. I'm talking about talk to them once a week, once a month, and understand what's happening there. Sending missions dollars, sending missions trips, and it keeps the heart of the church bigger than the just nya of Facebook or what this person is murmuring about it. Like, it keeps us on mission. It keeps us much bigger, so we're not drowning in smaller conversations.
And that is where I think so many people get bogged down, is they're drowning in the smaller things and getting caught up in these arguments that don't really matter, when a lot is happening in the globe, in the church. And the kingdom is advancing at a rapid rate in many other countries.
Man, it's amazing.
And if people were to not only hear about it, but go and see it, man, you'd be encouraged and really just fired up about what God is doing, because we only see a lot of times what we think he's not doing here.
And the critique for America only is that American church is very focused on America. And we have a stewardship, I believe, to some degree of this nation because of, it's a new nation. Much of this nation was founded on a desire to have freedom of religion, freedom of expression. And so many Christians view this country as almost a stewardship that, hey man, God gave us this country 200 years ago, and so we have to steward the Christian values that are here. And there is a hyper focus on America, and I don't want to entirely dismiss that idea, because I feel like it's important to think about your kids and your grandkids, and think about the place that you inhabit and desire. Lot had to abandon Sodom and Gomorrah because he could no longer live there. It had become so wicked that he no longer could live there. And so us being salt and light, I think there is a part of that impacts our nation.
Yeah. But
there's a much broader reality that many American Christians don't step into and embrace, which is, man, this is a big kingdom, and there's coming a day where all of these national boundaries will fall, and there's going to be one king. His name's Jesus, and that's our eternal destiny. So living up to that and lifting your eyes. Paul said in Colossians, set your sights on the realities of heaven, and where most people set their sights is down. And they're hopeless, and they're, but if you set your sights on a bigger picture. So, yeah.
That's good. You better preach on this sometime. Now, just big passion of Pastor Jonathan's is that, and that comes out of you often when you talk, but it's really about a much bigger kingdom. I would say that's a big part of the church in America's problems. Like you said, we're so self-focused that we don't realize what God is doing globally that is huge. And David Shibley, I don't know if you know who he is, years ago, dear friend, love him. He wrote a book called Living as If Heaven Matters. And I've always loved that title, because if you're living for this day and that day when he returns, you live with a kingdom mindset that's a much bigger picture than the minutia of the world that we live in today. So I know I'm personally challenged by that. And just going back to what we were talking about with every church and having those relationships, we have a lot of global relationships, and we send a lot of missions dollars. Where I'm challenged is more so of, I can only speak for our church, is I would like to send more people. Mm-hmm. And that's something I'm praying for in the coming years.
I think that it's amazing the passion that will erupt in people when they see the potential of adventure, fruit, life change that takes place when they put their foot on a foreign soil. And I haven't figured this out about the human nature, but we get comfortable in our environment. We go to the same Starbucks, we go to the same Publix and get our groceries, we go to the same school, pick up our kids. We live this route and we become spiritually dull, we become apathetic. But the moment we get lifted out of that environment and set onto a foreign soil, it's like something awakens in your soul that's like, oh my God, I'm alive for a much bigger purpose than my mundane little rhythm, and it awakens something. And so when you get people coming back from trips like that, and they share that with their friends, oh, you got to go, then it'll take over a church.
I can tell you every time that I've gone, and I've been on a number of trips over the years, like you can probably attest to this as well, but like you're on mission every day because you're there. And so it's like you come home and life seems boring. All the stuff that was normal for you that you really got comfortable in, it was like, I don't know, you got to start looking for those opportunities, because it's not, there's just something that came alive in you that when you were there that was like, man, we're doing something,
man, no, there's a reality to being dulled and calloused in mundane life that the Lord has to break us out of. In Luke 19, Jesus said, the Son of Man came to seek and save, which is lost. He was on a hunt, constantly looking for a lost person. In our lives, we're not seeking.
Right.
We're not seeking that which was lost. Most of the time, we're just living our life. And that does feel boring. That feels mundane. Right. But if you're out searching for something that's about to die, or someone who's about to die, you feel this sense of like, man, this is urgent. And every day has this sense of seeking. And that's what it means to live missionally. I know this podcast, we're supposed to talk about generational ministry. And I've been passionate about missional living, so that's kind of spilling out.
No, it's good. And really, I think that's, just to tie that together, though, I think that's how you have generational legacy, is that one generation is on mission and keeps passing that to the next generation. You go about it different ways. You may not go on a missions trip, 4 or 5 times a year. Everybody needs to go on at least one in their lifetime, in my opinion, at least.
Absolutely.
If not more. But those just keep you fired up to come back and live on the missional life that God called you to live where you are, because he maybe didn't call you to another country to live. He called you to where you are, and he has a purpose for you where you are. But sometimes that has to be awakened to say, hey, I got to get back on the right focus here. I got to start seeing through spiritual eyes, not just my physical eyes, of making money, going to school, going to work, coming home, paying the bills. I mean, that's a miserable life. Although all those things are a part of our life, man, it could be an adventure every single day.
Yeah, if you wake up, and I've been recently preaching to our church that each day can be mundane or missional. When you swing your legs over and they hit the ground, you can say, this is going to just be another mundane day, or this is going to be a missional day. And boy, you choose it right off the bat. Like, okay, if I'm missional, it means I'm seeking and saving that which was lost. I'm praying that the Lord would lead me to broken people. I'm praying that today would be a day I'm led by the Spirit. Every moment matters. When you live missionally like that, you're on your toes. When you live mundane, you just go through your business and you just live your life.
Yeah.
And engaging the body of Christ to think missionally, I think it's exciting.
Yeah, I love that. And even what you just said there reminded me of something that I've often said before. And I don't know if I came up with this or got it from somewhere else. So whoever said it,
I said it.
There's the credit.
No, I'm just playing.
It could definitely be you. I really don't know, but it was like there's these 3 things that used to come to me. Is like every day matters, every person has a purpose, and every prayer has power. And if you will approach every day like that, hey, this day matters, which means that I'm going to run across people who have purpose that God's putting in my path, and every prayer that I'm praying today really does have power. I mean, if we believed those 3 things, I think you would have a more missional living.
Yeah. So we've been doing something at the church called Mission Monday. And it's just simply trying to start our week out living missionally. It's easy on a church staff because people are there to do ministry. So I just clear out our offices and say, everybody go, come back in 3 hours. I want you to go out there to see what God could do. Some of them go out feeling lost. They don't know where they're headed.
Yeah.
But it's a super cool thing because, man, we've seen miracles happen. I'm not talking about supernatural miracles. We have seen some, but more just natural miracles, like reconnecting recently, last Monday, a homeless man staying under the bridge. Started a conversation with him. He said he had relatives living in Kenner. I thought he was drunk, but I said, "Do you have an address?" And he said, "Yeah." And he gave me an address. I sent somebody to the address in New Orleans. They were actually living. They started crying when they found out we found him. He is a mental patient, and he's been having seizures. And he was supposed to get off a Greyhound bus and never did.
Oh, wow.
And he's been missing now for a long time. They got in their car, drove there. I picked him up, put him in my car with all of his bags. I met him at our church, and we had a big reunion.
Come on.
They put him in the car, and I was like, if I would have chosen today to be a mundane day, there's no way I'd have gone and got James under the bridge. But now his family, I got to pray with his family. They're going to go check out our campus there in New Orleans. I'm like, yeah, man, this is what life is about.
Yeah.
It
becomes exciting, and that's awesome. I mean, like you said, you didn't miss a divine appointment because you were intentional about it. You didn't wait for something to come to you.
Right.
I love that. And just on that conversation, back to the generational legacy or generational ministry, man, I think that's just something that so many people underestimate, especially parents. If you just live it now, your kids will see it and they will live it, and their kids will see it and they will live it. If you want generational legacy in your family and generational ministry in your family, just live it. Just live it. Just start ministering to people wherever you are. Have people into your home. Go find people under a bridge. I mean, bring your family into it, and you'll see that it just repeats itself for generations.
Yeah.
So that's awesome. Okay, last question for you here.
Yeah.
You're a young leader. You're a couple years older than me, but like we talked about, you've been doing about 10, 11 years in this particular role. You have a lot of experience and wisdom. So a lot of people do look to you. I personally know a number of pastors that are constantly looking to you for advice and wisdom. So what's one piece of advice you'd give a young leader who would say, tell me about something you've learned? Like what's one of the greatest things that you've learned in the last 10 to 11 years?
If I'm talking to pastors, specifically young pastors, this is what I would tell you is God wired you with a unique gift and a grace. It's different than everybody else's. I know that sounds elementary, but many times when people begin to pastor a church or a ministry within the church, they lose their joy, they lose their sharp edge, and it's because they are trying to wear Saul's armor. They're trying to be somebody that they're not. And there is a moment where you're your happiest, where you are your most fulfilled. And you need to find out what that moment is and pour the gas on it. And the more you try to ignore that grace that's yours and try to battle in Saul's armor, you're going to get depressed, discouraged, want to quit because you were not meant to fight in this armor. But if you say, when I do this, I feel the strongest grace, I feel the strongest sense of purpose, I feel so filled with joy, then that's where you need to lead from. You need to lead from that place of strength because that's a place you can live because it's exciting.
Yeah.
For some people, it's prayer. For some people, it's kids ministry. For some people, it's students ministry. For some people, it's worship. For some people, it's missions. But if you ignore that strength, and so find out how to do that activity a lot and find out how to lead from that place because that's going to be where your greatest grace is.
You've personally told me that before, and it was some of the best advice, especially early on, that I had gotten because you're trying to find yourself. And
what would you say your greatest sense of joy when you do this ministry activity? You feel the greatest sense of fulfillment.
Oh man, you're putting me on the spot here. I think, I just like speaking into people's lives, whether it be from a larger scale or even a personal scale.
So after you've had a meaningful impartation into somebody, you walk away from that and you feel like, yes, that was it. Okay, John 4, Jesus says, my nourishment comes from doing the will of him who sent me and from finishing his work.
Yeah.
Jesus, he didn't even want bread after he did the thing at the well. And that was one-on-one ministry. Jesus' greatest grace was not the crowds. it was the one-on-one ministry. He loved it.
Yeah.
And so he was sitting there so fulfilled because he knew what he had just done. He had just delivered this woman from so much trauma, pain. And so he's sitting there feeling such nourishment. And he said, my nourishment comes. And there is a place of nourishment that will wash over you. And that is where your grace is. And you have to lead from that point, you know?
Yeah.
So if it's, hey, I love imparting into somebody, maybe it's leadership impartation, helping somebody take that next step in their life. So like, that's where you have to live from. That's where you have to lead from, is creating those moments where you're pouring into this individual and that individual, you know?
Yeah. And I think that's, like I said, that's helped me so much. And I think that's advice for everybody, because God has put things inside of you like that you find the greatest joy in. And the language you used, which is really, I've repeated to other people, is pour gas on it. You know, it's like, why would you try to pour gas on something that's not on fire? Pour gas on what's already on fire inside of you and run in that. So if, like he said, if you like to serve in a certain area, if leading at work or whatever it may be just fires you up, man, just start going after that with everything in you, and God will just open the right doors for you. He'll continue to grace it and continue to give you the open doors for His kingdom advancement. So, great advice. Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
That was a blast.
So honored to have you here with us today. If you want to know more about Jonathan Stockstill or Bethany Church, go to bethany.com. Follow them on social media.
No backslash.
/.gov.
No, definitely
no,
not
.gov. Just kidding. Bethany.com. But I would encourage everybody to check them out. If you're ever going through Louisiana, stop at one of their campuses, join them for church. I think Bethany is one of the churches in America that I don't think more people know about. They should, but it looks like heaven. If you've never been, Bethany looks like heaven. And that's a testimony to you and your heart and your family's legacy. So again, thank you for being with us today. Hey, if you want to join the conversation, you can always visit us on our website, wearencc.com, and you can text your questions to things we've talked about or you want to hear about to 903-200-3808. Thank you again for joining us today on the Around the Table podcast.